everyone. Happy Monday. Today is November 22nd for our Transportation Planning Environment Committee meeting for our November meeting. I'm going to go ahead and ask for introductions of everyone, and I will start with myself, go online, and then do the individuals in the room. I'm Mayor Pro Tem Julie Eisel, serving at large and chair of the committee.
Larkin Eggleston, committee vice chair.
Morning, everyone. Matt Newton, committee member.
How about staff members?
Taiwo Jerba, City Manager's Office.
John Lewis, Charlotte Area Transit System.
Ed McKinney, Charlotte Department of Transportation.
Liz Babson, Charlotte Department of Transportation.
Donata Jackson, Office of Constituent Services.
Lynn Alexander, Charlotte Department of Transportation.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. We have two agenda items this morning. Both are lengthy presentations, but of information that's really important. So I'm sure we'll have lots of questions too, and hopefully our presenters have some time at the end of their time allotment to allow for questions. This first item is the strategic mobility plan, and I'm going to turn it over to Liz Babson and Ed McKinney to give us that presentation.
Good morning, council and committee members. We're here today to update you on the work that has been progressing since we were before you at your retreat. We released our comprehensive transportation guidelines just last week and want to spend some time with you today to review that work. I think you'll be excited to hear about some of the things that we're bringing forward, because this effort responds to a lot of the concerns that we've heard from you recently about impacts from development and cumulative impacts from development. So Ed's going to go into more detail, but I want to summarize these guidelines do two important things for us. We are making a recommendation that we reduce the trip threshold for our current traffic impact studies, and we know that that's something we've heard from you over many zoning meetings. And we're also recommending the implementation of a more multimodal improvement process associated with development that aligns with new policy maps and future land use in the city of Charlotte, and is really geared toward focusing on improving pedestrian and bike safety and access to transit. And with that, I'll turn it over to Ed.
Thank you. Again, Ed McKinney with the Charlotte Department of Transportation. You can go to the next slide. So just to summarize what we want to cover today is, as Liz sort of described the kind of big thematic picture, I'll walk through a little bit more detail what these guidelines are, why they're important. We'll talk a bit about give the committee sort of a sense of the big changes and what's really driving the revision to these guidelines that we've created. If you go to the next slide, just to emphasize what Liz began to describe is why these are important. Keep in mind as to what are the big changes we have made in these guidelines. The first, traffic impact study guidelines, and so it's a very technical thing. Where council is familiar with these today is, for example, through rezonings. You'll see a lot of that in your review of zoning cases. When we have done a transportation analysis of a project, that analysis helps us determine the kinds of infrastructure and impacts that a project would have, and we work with then petitioners to define what their mitigation should be. So we have very specific traffic impact study guidelines that guide that work. And so what in particular related to all the big things we're doing, both specifically to the UDO, but obviously with the goals that we have around the 2040 comprehensive plan. So again, I'll describe what those changes are, but I wanted to make sure it was clear that we're doing a pretty dramatic update and replacement of those current guidelines. As Liz already mentioned, one of the things you've seen this in some of the development and rezoning cases, that sometimes we're recognizing that our thresholds may not be capturing as we'll talk about. We've also recognized that it's not just about cars. It's about multimodal. It's about making sure that we've got the pedestrian infrastructure, that we're supporting development when it's adjacent to transit. So it's really about mobility. We've seen this before. We've talked about this at your retreat. Again, to take a step back and kind of paint the picture of where this fits into the larger initiatives and efforts that are underway. The 2040 Comprehensive Plan obviously is the framework. Below that, as we talked about, there's several key initiatives that are underway: the policy map, the strategic mobility plan, and the Unified Development Ordinance. Where does this fit in? So under the strategic mobility plan, and related very specifically to both the policy map and the UDO, are these more technical things that we're calling our streets manual, and where the guidelines, these comprehensive transportation review guidelines, fit ultimately is within that document that we're calling the streets manual. That's again, sort of a technical support document that will, follows the vision and goals that we have in the comprehensive plan, ultimately are guiding our mobility efforts, but are specifically a technical tool, as I mentioned before, to the UDO. So these are the tools that we will use as development comes in and tied to the Unified Development Ordinance to help us in this case. And the topic today is to really specifically talk about the transportation review of development projects. And so we can come back to this, but I just want to remind you where this fits in its relationship to the major efforts that are underway, and in this case specifically the role of this manual and these guidelines relative to the Unified Development Ordinance. Next slide. Again, you've seen this schedule. This is just a reminder of where we are with all three of those larger initiatives. What's sort of highlighted here in red are the two things I just mentioned relative to the streets manual, the streets map work, which we talked briefly about at your retreat. We're not going to talk about that in detail today, but that's tied to the schedule and engagement around the policy map work. It's geographic based, and it sort of fits logically with the work and review and the engagement around the policy map. The comprehensive transportation review guidelines, what we want to talk about with you today, is really tied to the review, drafting, and engagement around the Unified Development Ordinance. So again, you see in red, essentially the message here is that we're following the draft review of the UDO. We'll follow the revisions and the additional drafts of the UDO, and ultimately the same review and adoption process that you will follow with the Unified Development Ordinance. And the point being there is these guidelines are really an important technical tool, implementation tool to the Unified Development Ordinance. Next slide. Again, you've seen this just to lay some context for some of the things, for the goals that we have around these guidelines that we have drafted. You've seen this. This is that slide that essentially pulls out a key goal from the 2040 Comprehensive Plan about mobility, essentially safe and equitable mobility. It's got 6 objectives. All I want to do here is mention that and remind you that we're really using, staff and our team are really using that as a way to make sure that what we're putting forward in the guidelines is tied to implementing the goals of this plan. And so highlighting words about safety, words around multimodal and connectivity, sustainability, equitable and affordable mobility options, innovation, managing congestion. You'll see those themes embedded in the things that we're trying to do in these guidelines related to, rethinking how we focus on congestion, rethinking how we're ensuring that we're getting multimodal infrastructure. So we're trying to use these guidelines as a way to truly and on the ground implement the objectives that we have in our comprehensive plan. So what does that mean? If you go to the next slide, let's just really quickly talk about where we are today and kind of where we're trying to go. On the one slide of this is just a very simple summary of what our current traffic impact study process looks like. Really overly simplified, but a couple key points that I think are important to know, and then think about how it relates to where we want to go from a policy standpoint. So focus very specifically on vehicle trips. We talked about the thresholds that we have, the analysis that we do, It's all designed around how do we understand the vehicular impacts of our of development. Very important, but as you'll see, and as we've been talking about over the last several years, there's other aspects of development impact related to mobility that we want to make sure we're covering. There's one threshold, and again, we mentioned this, and I'll share with you where we're going there in a minute, but as a reminder, we currently have one threshold. I think some of you will probably know this from memory, right? It's a 2,500 trip threshold. We apply that to development, and that's the one trigger we use to look at vehicular impacts. And then again, to reemphasize something I just mentioned, but it's that whole process is really tied primarily to the rezoning process, and to be even more specific, the conditional rezoning process. It's where we know what the development's going to be. We understand how much office or how much residential or how much commercial, and we're then able to calibrate and quantify the trip impact. We do that at the rezoning level and do that analysis as part of your approval. But as I'll talk about in a minute, we feel it's really important to have that tied not just to the rezoning process, but also to the by right development, particularly when we're in the site plan approval process. Where are we trying to go? So just real quickly on that slide, go back. I want to make a point about the policy piece. This is a very specific piece of that goal 5 that's in our comprehensive plan that's very specific to this expectation that we're thinking and rethinking these development review guidelines. So it's really a goal in the plan that says let's look at and include a rethink of our development regulations, particularly to this notion of kind of a more integrated traffic, travel demand, and multimodal aspects. So again, very specific expectation of the comp plan that we're really trying to implement through these review guidelines. So today, where we are and kind of where the policy is trying to take us into the future. Next slide. This starts to now frame what is sort of what I would describe as sort of the outline of the technical document. And again, designed in this case to try to help have this conversation with council and the public about what we're trying to do. So think about, we tried to simplify it if you thought about 3 questions. So as new development comes in, what's the questions we want them to answer, and what are the places we want to focus in terms of infrastructure? So the first one is very simple. How are we moving people? It's really about the pedestrian. It's really about the people that are living, working, and engaging in the places and the development that's being built. So it's what we're designing there is a multimodal infrastructure assessment. What's new in this case is just a simple assessment that for projects to identify the pedestrian needs that they have in the immediately sort of adjacent around them. And so those include things like just intersection improvements in our accessible ramp infrastructure, sidewalk gaps, or in some cases, just another example where we might have places where we're looking for additional pedestrian crossings. I'll talk about that in more detail, but the message there is question, how are we moving people? What's a very simple way to assess that from a pedestrian standpoint and the types of projects and investments that it would focus on. The next one is, again, a new one, again, thinking about where we are going as a city and the goals we have in the comprehensive plan, about how can we think about development and its ability to manage and potentially even reduce trips. And we've seen this on several larger rezonings recently, where what we're calling this is transportation demand management, TDM. It's a larger topic. Lots of cities across the country are doing this in different ways, but it's how do we find ways, depending upon the nature and intensity and mix of development, to employ both programmatic and physical things that really change the behavior of how people move and how they get to them. In some cases, if you're adjacent to a transit station, maybe the scale of that project suggests that the project can provide for incentivized transit passes. In some cases, it's physical things, like if you're an office project and you've got the ability to have the facilities on site for showering, so that if someone's commuting by bike, they have a very convenient way to do that. So again, a couple of examples where what we want to do is introduce into this assessment an ability to identify, if given the right type of project, identify the ways that we can actually reduce and manage traffic before we even think about the vehicular traffic aspect. So the last question here is, okay, how are we managing traffic? And again, based on some new thresholds, and some, what I'll talk about in a minute, sort of revised, more intensity-based thresholds after we've looked at pedestrian and multimodal infrastructure, after we've found as many ways as we can to manage and reduce trips. Now let's focus on what we need to do in terms of traffic. And so the studies, again, we will continue to do traffic impact studies. We'll change some of those thresholds and design them to be a little bit more focused and intensity-based, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So 3 questions. The things that are new, again, are moving this notion of a multimodal analysis, this TDM aspect of that review, and then ultimately building upon what we already do today with some revised thresholds around how are we analyzing traffic impacts. Go to the next slide. Let me just talk about those 3 questions. The first, just give you a little bit of a flavor of what we're trying to do in each of those. The first 2 are summarized here, which is how are we moving people? How are we reducing trips? So it goes back to this notion of a multimodal assessment and a TDM assessment. And what we've done in these guidelines is try to make this as sort of formulaic and simple to follow and predictable as possible. So the notion is, looking at each project, sort of what context are you? And so in this case, we've designed a way that we're tailoring it really to the draft of the UDO and the specific types of zoning districts. So depending upon the zoning district, that will help us understand kind of what menu of things we want you to do. Depending upon, the next question is really what land use are you? So different land uses and different mixes of land uses create different patterns of travel and different generation of trips and patterns. And so we want to understand the context, what land use, and then ultimately how big are you? So those are all questions that you can answer without an engineer. Those are very simple, sort of basic, what kind of project are you? What zoning district are you? What's the mix of land use and how much of it is it? Which gets you to the notion of tiers. So then it's really a triggering thing. What scale of project are you based on those 3 criteria? We've then defined essentially a menu of both pedestrian and TDM strategies. And so depending upon what scale, you would fall into a certain type of tier. We would have an expectation for the kind of level of investment to mitigate the kind of impacts that we're talking about. And we have some very specific menus of the kind of sidewalk gaps. We've got a lot of good data about where those needs are already. So in many ways, when a project comes in, we can already predict what we need around you, and we use this assessment to just trigger what's your sort of proportional fair share. Same thing with TDM. When you're in an intense enough district, and a good example would be any of our TODs districts, where you're already an intense district, you're already adjacent to transit, we've got an established menu that we can then work with you to find appropriately what's the way that you can, depending upon the scale and mix of that project, what strategies can you employ to essentially take advantage of that infrastructure and help us, again, assess and manage traffic and mobility based on the specific context you are and the specific intensity that you're in. So all that, again, to say is this is completely new. This is not something we do today. We do it today sort of informally through the conditional rezoning process. What we're trying to do is codify it in a more predictable way throughout the city and based on the intensity of use, but do it in a very simple, hopefully easy to follow process. Next part, let me just talk through what we're trying to do on traffic. So if we've now answered the first couple of questions about moving people and reducing trips, the next question is, okay, how are we managing traffic? If you go to the next slide, let's talk a little bit about thresholds. So what's new? We've already mentioned it, that we want to reduce thresholds. I would also add to that we want to really revise those based on intensity. And so what's on this slide, just for context, is to give you a sense of where our thresholds are comparatively to other cities, and in this case, North Carolina. So you can see, the cities like Raleigh, Raleigh's probably the best comparable example. Their trip threshold is 1,500 trips, where ours is 2,500. You can see pretty consistently as several cities with that threshold. There's a few, Huntersville is a good example, Rock Hill, that have even a lower threshold. All that to say is just to give you some context of where we think we can be better aligned with what's around us, and particularly what we think is an appropriate standard that's been applied, particularly for development in North Carolina and cities like Raleigh. So certainly we think there's room to reduce that threshold. But we also recognize that one size does not fit all. That's a big, important part of the message that we want to convey to you, is that Charlotte is different than any of those cities. We have a geography that's many times larger and a context that's different. And so we think the intensity and sort of context-based approaches is really where we want to go. If you go to the next slide, just to give you a sense of what that could look like. So what we've done is a lot of information on the slide, but I'll try to simplify it, is we think there's sort of a simple way to think about it is sort of low and sort of high intensity places in Charlotte. And so again, ultimately calibrated specifically to the UDO zoning districts that are being reviewed now, we believe there's a way to sort of categorize the kind of level of intensity you are, and therefore have different thresholds. And there's sort of maybe something that's a little counterintuitive, but I want to describe. As you can see, there's two thresholds here. If you're in a high intensity place, our threshold, what we're proposing is 200 trips or 2,000 trips. If you're in a lower intensity place, we put that all the way down to 1,500 daily trips. The rationale there is, again, back to the context. If you're, our presumption and what we think we want to test, particularly with the UDO and the place types, is if you're a medium or high intensity place, take, again, a good example of that would be a TOD zoning or a TOD place. We want to really focus on the multimodal things. We want to focus on the TDM things. We do recognize that we do have to address traffic when we can and when we should, given the scale of development. So we do still believe there should be a trigger, but we feel that trigger should be a little higher, because what we really recognize in some of those places, there's not things we really want to do from a vehicular standpoint. We really want to enforce or strengthen the multimodal environment around it and support its connection to the infrastructure that we've already got in place. So the idea there, we still have a threshold. We've reduced it a bit, but we really want it to be more focused on the multimodal TDM aspects. When you're in a lower intensity place, some of the more what we would describe as suburban places, where the infrastructure maybe isn't quite there yet, we're still doing the multimodal analysis. So we're still using this comprehensive review to look at that infrastructure, but we also recognize that those lower intensity places are the places where the reliance on vehicular travel is more, where there's still infrastructure to be built from a vehicular standpoint. And so we want to make sure that we've got a way for those kinds of projects to more comprehensively address the traffic impact. So again, two standards. They both have been reduced from what we have today, but we feel like when you're in a higher intensity place, that threshold should be a little bit higher, a little more accommodating for the focus on multimodal investment. When you're in a lower intensity place, we feel like that threshold should come down, and it'll give us the ability to think through the vehicular infrastructure that we need in that kind of a context. Maybe the last couple of slides, and then we can jump into kind of discussion and questions. If you go to the next slide, you've seen this one before. We shared this briefly with you at your retreat, and so I wanted to go back to this example just to give you a flavor of what I've just described and how it would apply to a project. So as you may recall, we picked a project. This is the 500 East Moorhead project. This is an office development on Moorhead. It's about an 180,000 square foot office building. It's got some retail, a restaurant on the ground floor. So sort of an urban office mixed use project. You're on Moorhead, just literally blocks from Uptown and walkable blocks from our Blue Line transit corridor. From a place type standpoint, and again, Allison and planning had shared with this with you at the retreat, where that's currently sort of in draft form, the notion of is this project would sit in what would be called a regional activity center place, or immediately adjacent to Uptown. And ultimately, the kind of zoning district that would apply here is what's been in the draft called Urban Edge, which is a category that's, again, related to the Uptown intensity and level of development, sort of on the edge of Uptown. So probably one of our highest intensity zoning districts, one of our high intensity place types, and you're immediately adjacent, several blocks from our transit infrastructure. So how would these apply? So again, the first question, how are we moving people? Yes, you would do a multimodal analysis. And this is an interesting example where at this intersection, this image shows us the intersection of Caldwell and Moorhead was actually a place where we had identified the need for a signal, particularly for a pedestrian crossing, to get across the corridor of Moorhead. It got better access to uptown and to between the neighborhoods. It was better access to transit. This was a need where we needed that signal. It had been identified as a project, but was sort of sat within the kind of the prioritization list of projects on our list, and would, through the natural course of things, come and be invested in as we had public money to do it. In this case, it would be a great example when this project came in for review. That project and signal had already been identified. We would then sit down through that review and identify what's the appropriate level of investment that this project could do to support that signal, whether it would be supporting a certain amount of that funding or actually implementing the signal itself. The point there is it's a specific project. It's specifically tied to the context of this project, and we would use this analysis to make that connection between the infrastructure we need from a pedestrian standpoint and the development that's coming in on the ground. From a TDM standpoint, for sure, yes, this would also trigger a TDM analysis. Again, to emphasize the point, you're literally blocks from our transit corridor, and this is sort of an example. We would work certainly with the specifics of the project, but depending upon what they're doing, again, if they have the ability or already allowing for shower facilities on site, maybe they have the ability to provide. The office can provide some transit subsidy to the passes. All of the things, there's sort of a long menu of things that we would want to encourage the development to do to help support that connection to our transit system, or help support connection to other alternative modes of travel, all sorts of other programmatic things. So yes, you would do that analysis, that assessment, and essentially work to find the appropriate level of response to that scale of project. And then here's a good example where the scale of this project would not have triggered the 2,000 trips. That new threshold. It would be at a high intensity place. That threshold that we're proposing is 2,000 trips. It wouldn't have triggered that. In fact, and it's sort of a good example in our minds where that's sort of what we want the guidelines to do, right? We recognize that in this case, there aren't really vehicular investments that we would want to make in this context. What we really want is the multimodal and the TDM examples. And so, again, a good test example in a very high intensity place, how these guidelines might apply, and the notion of how we're trying to be a little bit more context sensitive to what we're emphasizing, whether it's multimodal, transportation demand management, or ultimately managing traffic and congestion. Lots of other examples. I'll talk a little bit about what we're doing next in terms of testing these. I'm sure you have lots of questions about how this would apply to all sorts of different types of projects, and we've got some more work we're doing to kind of test that more holistically, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Last slide, just to kind of emphasize, kind of putting this all back together. The comprehensive review guidelines are around these three questions: moving people, reducing trips, managing traffic. What we've proposed in each of those: moving trips, a new threshold, a very specific kind of assessment that gets you to the kind of investment we just talked about. Same thing for the TDM, reducing trips. There's a threshold. We would determine your tier of investment and work to based on an established menu of choices, what's the right level of investment for that project. And the last one, managing traffic, we have reduced thresholds. We've revised them, as we mentioned, to the sort of the context of intensity, with a sort of a three-step process of how are we doing a multimodal assessment, how are we doing a transportation demand assessment, and then ultimately what's our traffic impact study process look like. Just to compare, just as a reminder, what we do today is, again, for the multimodal assessment, there's no formal requirement. I would say we do, and our staff does, work every day to informally and sort of without direct sort of policy as we're reviewing projects. We're certainly getting lots of investment just through good coordination, good collaboration with development, but not in a predictable way. Same thing with TDM, as you've seen on some major rezoning cases. We've got some great partners with large projects, and our team has worked with them to do some really innovative things from a TDM standpoint, but it's really been project specific and not without a clear structure. And then, as I've emphasized already today, we've really only been focused on traffic. We really only have one threshold. It's a relatively high threshold, and we think now is the time to rethink that threshold and put it in the context of this broader comprehensive transportation review. So with that, I think the last slide just goes back to schedule. One thing I would just say goes back to my kind of the comparison of that one project. I do want to emphasize the draft came out, as Liz mentioned, about a week ago. We're now working sort of hand in hand with the work that the planning department is doing on the review and engagement around the UDO draft. In this case, very specifically, what we've done is we want to take these guidelines and incorporate them very specifically in the economic impact analysis that the planning department is doing relative to the UDO, because as you would imagine, these new guidelines have are just as important as the other aspects of the UDO relative to the economic impact of development. So we recognize that. We're including these now in that process. Our anticipation is we want to do a bunch of test sites. Like we'll start to see how this applies to less intense places, how it applies to different types of projects and uses, so that we can work with and understand kind of and assess what, have we got it right, or there's some things we might want to revisit and rethink. We want to do that as part of that review process, specifically in collaboration with the work that the planning department is doing. Ultimately, with the notion of getting revisions and revised drafts on the same schedule and review approval process as the larger UDO project. So with that, I will stop and be glad to open it up for broader discussion.
Thank you very much, Ed. Wow, that's a lot. That's huge. It feels like a seismic shift that I think a lot of people are really happy to see with regards to the way we analyze traffic impact right now. I wanted to go back to something that you said about by right, because this came up, Tylo and I were talking about this last week, and I'm still not quite sure how you're going to do by right or what's really even required now for by right, because we don't talk about that a lot. But I'll give you an example, and we talk about this, we have over the past few years, when there's a traffic impact study done on one project, are we taking into account everything else that's also being built at that time and how collectively it has an impact on that area? But even more importantly, I brought this example up last week with Taiwo, that we now have by right in the TOD, and you see in the south end where Price's Chicken built that building, that's going to be a 30-story building, and so presumably you're saying it's going to have a higher threshold because it's in a high density area. But Camden is Camden. We're not changing our roads, and I can't even fathom what all of that by right development is going to do to streets like Camden and South Boulevard as well. But, how does this new approach really look at what we're doing to our existing street infrastructure? And then I'll throw in there, because I have had some people send me comments that are, Mr. Phipps has said, why not? Well, I'll get to that later. But if you would please address the issue of the impact that we're putting on those streets right now that aren't going to change, especially with by right development.
Sure. No, it's a really great question. It relates to kind of what we've been trying to make sure that we're wiring in these guidelines. So let's take the TOD example, and for purposes of the discussion, we can use the Price's Chicken as a good example, right? So that's currently by right TOD zoning. In fact, what we did when that TOD zoning got adopted, 2-3 years ago, we sort of anticipated the need for this change. And so, for example, there is a trigger embedded in the by right TOD today that says if you're a certain scale of development, I may get this wrong, but I think the threshold in there, we calibrated it to 2,000 trips in the existing TOD zoning ordinance, which was sort of a precursor to what we're describing today. So for example, when that project comes in, It's by right, but it automatically triggers, depending upon the scale of the project, again, to that trip threshold, the ability for us to do a traffic, in this case today, just a traffic impact study. What we're proposing, to your larger point, what we're proposing in these guidelines, though, is that project's a good example where the infrastructure, whether we like it or not, the infrastructure there is already there, primarily already in the road infrastructure and the transit. So that's a place where there is not major traffic investment that we can do. It's already got the road network. We're not going to be adding, turn lanes at intersections. We're trying to make that. Now that's in the middle of South End. We want it to be walkable. You're literally, on the station, right? You're literally you're part of the transit corridor itself. So we expect that this intense development is there being served by transit. But what's new to these guidelines would apply. So we would take a project like that, and we would want them, and based on triggers, they would definitely trigger a multimodal assessment. So we know that South End, we've got great transit infrastructure. We probably have about as much traffic infrastructure as we can find, but we have lots of needs for pedestrian mobility infrastructure. There's still sidewalk gaps in South End. There's still places and intersections that need ADA accessible improvements, signals that need ADA improvements. There's still lots of we would describe as multimodal infrastructure that's needed. And today, we don't have an ability to get that through by right development. We can work and be collaborative with development to get some of that, but what these guidelines imply is we want to be specific and predictable and have the ability as big projects like that come in that we would work with them to essentially establish what level of tier they would be and how much multimodal infrastructure we would expect. Again, most of those projects, again, we're not making up. We already know what those needs are. It's just a matter of tying them to the project itself. And then from a TDM standpoint, another great example where, and I think Katz would see the wisdom of this is when we're literally a block from a station and we've got a project that's intense, should be at a point where we need to expect those projects to be doing things to support the use of that transit system. So it can be any number of things in terms of, again, potentially coordinating with our current TDM efforts and transit passes, making multimodal mobility, again, things like shower facilities or just bike facilities at the project itself. There's other programmatic things that are part of our menu. So the expectation is a project like that should be doing everything it can to support the people that are living or working in it to use the system and the investment that we've made. And so, again, to emphasize, a great example of why we think it's important that these guidelines apply to by right. In this case, the example we're using is in a TOD station. Today, we don't have the ability to predictably get the kind of multimodal investment we want. We don't have a way to predictably get the kind of TDM response that we want. And again, in this one example, it's a good example where we'd rather not spend the time talking about the vehicular impacts. Let's spend the time talking about the multimodal TDM impacts because we've already built essentially the transit infrastructure that's necessary. I'll stop there. I know you had another question around the cumulative impact, but maybe I'll stop there on that question and see if there's...
Well, I think I hope that we can visibly see that shift because there's no way that 30-story building is not going to be building a parking deck. But to see in that parking deck, to your point, the infrastructure for bicycles, we still have a huge number of gaps getting to our high-density areas on bike infrastructure and, safe guarded lanes for bicyclists to travel. And I think we really have to push our by right to recognizing they're going to ask for some parking facilities, the right to have parking facilities, and we do need that too, but we also need to really show that there is other infrastructure that allows people to get there in other ways. So I will, in collectively looking at, again, South Boulevard, Camden area, looking at the overall impact of that and not just looking at one project, I think is really critical. I have a couple council members who have questions. I'm just going to ask Mr. Phipps' question. He's on YouTube. His question was, why not keep 2,500 TIS trigger for the high intensity development?
It's a good question. So if the notion is today we've got a 2,500 trip threshold. We've got this 2 tiers. We lowered the high intensity just by 500 trips to the 2,000. That's a fair question. We believe, as you saw, when we compared ourselves to other cities in North Carolina, we also did compare ourselves to other national cities. Some good examples: Denver, Minneapolis, Austin, all of which we can provide some more of this information, but all of which are lower than what we have as well. So we did feel overall that it was time for us to think about lowering. But as you saw, we also didn't want to lower it too low in those high intensity places. So that's a question that may be part of what we will test. And we're going to do some more specific testing examples to see, did we get that number right? That's a fair question. I think our goal in those high intensity places again was to only have the trigger there when the project was just so big, and it gives us the potential that if there are, we're assuming that in most high intensity places we've exhausted all the kind of vehicular infrastructure we need, and we've already got the multimodal infrastructure, but that's not always going to be the case. So we know we need a threshold at some point to test that. But I think we're open to kind of testing the specifics of the thresholds. That is something we can continue to look at as we do the review.
Okay, thank you. I've got 3 council members with their hands up. We'll have Mr. Eggleston and then Mr. Driggs and Mr. Winston. So Mr. Eggleston, go ahead.
Thank you. A couple of questions. One, to continue on the example of the Price's Chicken Coop proposed development. If I remember correctly, it's a mix of retail, residential, and office. In a situation like that, if we were encouraging them, and I understand the point that there's not really a lot that can be done in terms of road investment in that corridor, if we're asking them to, for instance, implement some sort of a transit pass program, who are we actually making that agreement with? Because the developer there is going to build it, either lease it, sell it, whatever. Is that something we're putting kind of as almost leans the wrong word, but I can't think of a better word, on the building, and the management of the residential component is obligated to build that into the rents, and the people will just have a transit pass, or the office tenants are obligated to participate in this program if they want to work or rent space in that building? How does that work?
Yeah, no, it's another good question. What I would describe is what we're proposing here is sort of one initial way to do it, and there's lots of other cities that do it in a much more specific way. So let me describe what we're proposing, which is, we feel where we are today is what we're trying to find is as many partnerships and opportunities to do these things as we can, and test to see how successful they can be. So in this example, what we would do is as that development comes through the typical land development review process, we would do this kind of assessment. We would determine what that menu of things would be, and then we would have essentially it's agreed upon with a relationship. In that case, just with the initial, and this, if it's an office or a residential project, it's the management company that's running that initial project. The weakness of that is we're doing it initially through the initial development review with the initial owner or manager, and we're defining that day one, with the hope and partnership that continues. You can go a step further, and there are cities that do, and there are cities that have very specific TDM ordinances where there's a much more technical and stronger tie to that through your development review and approval. Our take is where we think we are in this exercise of thinking about TDM is we feel like this is the right first step. We feel like it gets us at the table to have those conversations as development occurs. It allows us in that period to kind of test, see what works, see what's successful, and then as we move forward and as some of these places mature, maybe it'll be time for us to be more, to wire that a little bit more specifically in our ordinances. I say all that to say that you hit on something that is a struggle for us, that we feel like what this proposes is not something that really, in the longer term, gives us the ability to hold someone to it, right? 5 years from now, that could be a different owner. There's not some step there where we could go in, we are not proposing some step where we could go in and enforce, checking. We do want to monitor. Our expectation is we would have a database of all the agreements that we've come up with. We would continue to reach out to those partners in a way for us initially just to track what's successful and to see what's working. But to be totally transparent, we haven't really wired in these guidelines a very specific trigger that allows us to stay on that over the long term of the project.
Yeah, that's certainly my concern, is that out of the gate, there'd be folks that would be amenable to it, but then management or ownership changes hands and people say, well, I don't want to do that anymore. And have we created any real way to enforce that? Second question, on slide 9, we identified, along with things like transit pass programs and bicycle infrastructure sort of in the project, i.e. showers, bike lockers, things, whatever. And we've identified sidewalk gaps as sort of an outside the project investment people can make. I assume that this would be included, but I want to make sure that we sort of call it out as a specific example, because I think it's a specific opportunity, is gaps in our on-road bicycle infrastructure, so bike lanes, dedicated or protected bike paths, whatever it is, or maybe even as it relates to greenways in some instances. And when you think about a project like the Metropolitan, if there were an opportunity to help connect, obviously the connection there is made now, but because I think that one of the complaints we frequently get, as you well know, is that people say, well, you get in a bike lane on some roads and then all of a sudden it's gone and you're just sort of out there in the wild in traffic. So I think if we're identifying sidewalk gaps and identifying some types of bicycle infrastructure, I want to make sure we look for opportunities to connect the disconnected or fill the gaps in some of that infrastructure. So that's not really a question, really a comment. And I guess my last one is, do we currently, or are we considering, or can we even say that for any structured parking we are permitting or approving the construction of, that bicycle infrastructure to some degree or another is required?
So to your question on bike infrastructure, I don't have all the details of the draft you do have memorized, but I know we've gone a long way in the current draft to wire in just basic requirements for bicycle parking facilities in the base UDO district. So we've added that as I think just across the board, in particular types of zoning districts, a requirement for that for sure. So I think I'll have to let planning speak to how much that has changed based on what we do today versus what the draft of the UDO is. What we're doing here is trying to go on top of that, right? To say that in cases where there's opportunities for, is it in additional to the required parking that the zoning district requires, there's, bicycle repair kinds of things you can provide for, like we've talked about already, the showers. There's, more secure parking that you can provide. We've got a menu of those kinds of things that, well, our goal in this would be like, what can we do on top of what our base requirements are to make it, even more attractive. And back to the point of where I think we are in these guidelines is we're still learning. Our hope is that if we apply this, maybe part of the next period of time would be to kind of see what works and see what's appropriate in Charlotte in different parts, and that would help us think through the specifics. Let me quickly go back to your question also about what our menu of things are relative to bicycle facilities. And back to your TDM question, one of the other things we wanted to do and are emphasized in our guidelines is, from a TDM standpoint, physical things first, because we know that, to your point, like some programmatic things are harder for us to enforce over longer term, so let's emphasize the physical things like a bicycle, facilities. And we also have opportunities, and part of the menu would be the things like, okay, can a project provide a connection to the Cross Charlotte Trail, and you get credit for that, and we incentivize for that. The only part I do want to make a point about those, that one of the challenges is we have, different than sidewalk gaps with bike gaps, is when the bicycle facility that disappears, 3 or 4 blocks away, it really is hard to make a project do that, because then when you're doing that, you're really talking about a road project. It's a longer term, like the complication of inserting bicycle facilities on a corridor is harder for a single project to do. They can, in some cases, we've got the ability that if they can provide for that facility on their frontage, and we incentivize that. If they can provide that other connection, we incentivize that.
Yeah, the other example that came to mind for me is the Belmont Mills project on 10th Street, where White Duck Taco is. I think on the backside of that, I think it's part of that rezoning or redevelopment. They helped us connect the dots on that 7th to 10th Street piece of the Cross Charlotte Trail. So understanding they can't necessarily change the conditions out on the street just unilaterally, but where those opportunities exist for either right of way or connections.
And that's another great point of why what these guidelines do is it triggers that conversation to be had, not just in the conditional rezoning process. It really will trigger us to be having that conversation on every by right development. We keep it simple. We're not trying to make it onerous for development, but sometimes those solutions are very simple. That conversation just needs to be forced as part of the process.
That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Eggleston. And to that point, we don't want to make it onerous for development, but we don't want to make it onerous for the people that have to get around in that area. And I think it's becoming onerous. So I really feel like we need some other options on this, Ed. Mr. Phipps has said that he has a concern that there's no line of demarcation between medium and high intensity for the TIS trigger. So, and then I'll get to Mr. Driggs and Mr. Winston, but I would just ask if we could have a couple other options to look at that are maybe a little bit more bold with regards to looking at asking what other cities do, asking landlords to provide, if it's not transit passes, because if a new owner comes in, you can't obligate them to that, perhaps paying into a transit fund. We don't have that right now, but a transit fund instead of the density bonus going to affordable housing, something that's not going to be built to have an impact in that area doesn't help us with that area. So, looking at options to say, instead of putting money into affordable housing, putting money into a transit fund to make improvements in that exact area. I do think it's becoming onerous to get around these areas. I understand why we're doing it, and we need to create density on our transit routes. But I'm just worried that we're not going to get there fast enough, even with these great changes and changes in strategies. So I would ask for some other options, and then I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Mr. Driggs for his question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Further to your point about by right development, none of this applies to places that don't get redeveloped. And there are many locations that may not be redeveloped for 20 or 30 years. So we could end up with a kind of a patchwork of compliance. And if we don't find a way to join up sidewalks, bike paths, and things like that, it could be a long time before we actually achieve the network we want. I actually have several questions, and I'm going to filibuster a bit to try to crowd out Mr. Winston. So I assume, therefore, that you're not contemplating any deed restrictions as a means of imposing requirements on subsequent owners. Is that right?
Correct. I think, make sure I heard your question. You mentioned deed restrictions.
Right. I'm saying I assume you're not contemplating any deed restrictions as a way of having requirements travel with the property to a new owner.
No, we're not.
All right. I have to say I'm really happy that you're looking at this, because I think our current process with the traffic studies is woefully inadequate, and I've struggled with it the whole time I've been on council. And I'm looking at it from a practical standpoint. I consider a situation like Providence Road, and I say to myself, okay, how do the problems that we have on Providence Road get fixed by what you're describing? And I'm encouraged by what you're saying. One of the things I wonder about, though, is what will the methodology be for the traffic study when it's required? So are people going to hire Randy and get him to do the same thing he did before? Or does the analysis have to be adapted to these new requirements?
That's a great question. The way I would answer it, back to this notion that we've got, again, three simple categories: the multimodal assessment, the TDM assessment, and then the actual traffic impact study. So for the actual traffic impact study, as you saw, we've changed thresholds. I would say we've refined and kind of modernized the methodology that we currently have. But I think our argument would be we haven't changed dramatically the requirements and how a traffic consultant would do a TIS in these guidelines. The thresholds have changed. You would still need a traffic engineer to do that analysis. We've refined the thresholds. We've again clarified and modified some of the sort of scope and methodology of that, but not dramatically different. So you would still, if you're a project that triggers the TIS component of the broader comprehensive transportation review, you would still need to have a traffic consultant do that work. But we have, on the TDM and the multimodal assessment, we believe it's important that those, particularly take the multimodal one as an example, where that's something that any site designer, any project that's doing a development, has got an architect and a civil engineer and a site designer, and most of the answers to the questions we need to answer on the multimodal assessment can be answered by those development consultants. So my point being there is we're not trying to create more work that's not already being done, and we want to make sure that it's clear about kind of what a development would need and who they would need to hire to do this work. On the TDM, similarly, it's again the menu that we've described and the kinds of things that we put on the table are not overly technical. They're sort of national best practices. Many developers are already familiar with them today, so it's really just a matter of negotiating with the development, what's appropriate, what can they do. And so, again, my point there is on those first two, the multimodal and the TDM, we want to try to keep it to where it's really done. It can be easily done by any developments doing development regardless. If you're triggering a TIS like today, you would still, yes, need a traffic engineer to do that technical work.
So I guess my point is that the work the traffic engineer does needs to be holistic in the sense that they are working currently on a set of national norms that are defined by institutes, but it's not necessarily in the context of what we're talking about. So if we're doing things that otherwise mitigate vehicular traffic by offering other alternatives, then that should be reflected in the assessment on the traffic. I think our current rules say that if you can create a 3% increase in projected trips without doing any mitigation as a developer, but if you actually cause more than a 3% increase, then you're expected to pay for mitigation. Is that right? And would that continue?
Well, so what I would say is we have and these are some of the weeds, and we'd be glad to walk you through some of these details at a future time as well. But you're catching on a very specific component of our scoping analysis in a TIS where you're analyzing a particular intersection. Your project has created X amount of traffic, and depending upon how much your project, the level of impact you would have on the level of service or the delay of that intersection would be when we would trigger and expect the response or the investment. And so I would say we've made some adjustments to that. That's probably a level of detail, but probably better to walk you through again in a subsequent meeting. We can walk you through some of those details. But you're right, we are looking at and making sure that we've got some rational clarity about when you're a project, the level of impact you're having relative to, again, a specific intersection. There are certain levels by which we determine what's reasonable, what's rational, that you can actually invest or actually modify and improve at that intersection. There's got to be, the other thing I would say about that, though, just to be transparent, there's a lot of engineering judgment that goes into that regardless of what threshold or what trigger we put in, because there's just lots of places where there's things that just are not feasible, that are not practical. So there's a lot of work that just happens to determine both the impact of a project, but what's the practicality of the kind of investments that would be made. And it's important, like every city and like even NCDOT has, there's a level of flexibility that's embedded in those guidelines to give good just engineering judgment to be happening as development occurs.
So one of the other issues as I think about a Providence Road type of situation is that sometimes you will have development in an area where there's a lot of undeveloped land. And it seems like we do this kind of piecemeal, and our assessment of a particular petition is not informed by any kind of forward-looking anticipation about other development. And for example, there's hundreds of acres around Waverly that haven't been developed yet. There's stuff further along, further south on Providence Road. And so a lot of my constituents say, are you thinking at all about what this is going to look like as those incremental projects come along? Or are we just going to choke off development because we permitted a whole bunch of stuff using one set of criteria? So do we have a kind of bigger picture context in which we're considering these things?
We do. So to sort of defend our process a bit, I would say a couple things. And these get into the technical details of our scoping process for TIS and traffic impact studies. They're not, this isn't perfect, but a couple things I want you to know that we do today, which is for every project that we do at TIS, there's a negotiated discussion and some assumptions that get built into just the amount of what we call background growth. So if your project on, so for example, Providence Road is a good example, every TIS that we do on that corridor is going to assume, based on some historic projections that we have that do tie themselves to land use change, that we're anticipating that the corridor is just going to grow a certain amount in traffic anyways, and the development has to recognize that and incorporate that into their analysis. And then in some cases where the projects are defined and big enough around them, and certainly if we've done other traffic analysis or studies on projects that are immediately adjacent to a proposed project, they also are taking that study and those specific projects into consideration as they're doing their analysis. So there's a process. This gets a lot into the weeds of our study process, but we go through a sort of a scoping exercise in each one, and we determine and make some determinations about how much growth, just background traffic growth, is happening as a reflection of land use growth. And we also incorporate, again, projects that are immediately adjacent. All of those assumptions, when they're available to us, do get built into the analysis. Now, I don't say all that to say that that's a perfect crystal ball or that solves for the cumulative discussion that we've been having, but I do want council and the public to know that we do those things, and they are an approximation for how we think about the cumulative growth of traffic around a project.
I just know there have been a couple of higher density petitions on Providence Road that kind of got approved because they met requirements. And when people ask me, so what are we doing? I didn't know the answer. And I haven't seen evidence of a sort of context constraint that was applied. So I'm glad to hear you say that, Ed. But we might talk a little more offline. My last question is, how radical a change is this from what we do now? And have we thought about economic impact?
Yeah, so again, another great question. I'm not going to use the word radical, but I would say it's change. We are trying to reflect the goals and expectations of the comprehensive plan. As Liz mentioned earlier, we're also, even before the adoption of the comprehensive plan, we have been in lots of conversations with council about some of the issues you're bringing up about cumulative impact, our ability to deal with the growth that we're happening. So we're taking all of that, and that's enfolded in these guidelines. They are different. I mean, as you saw, we're adding two things that developers aren't required to do today, that multimodal analysis, and in some cases where you're intense, that TDM analysis. So that's new and different. So from a development standpoint, that's going to look new. They're going to have questions. We're lowering thresholds, so that's going to raise attention as well. So I would say all of these things are cumulatively, this is a dramatically new approach with lots of changes. To your question about economic analysis, absolutely. As I think I mentioned, we are now totally in the process with the planning department on the economic impact analysis that's underway now with the overall UDO. So we're going to add this to that conversation. So these guidelines and the implication of these guidelines are absolutely part of that process. And over the next several months, we're working with the planning department and the stakeholder group that's been formed around that analysis to test this and to certainly be transparent about what we think the trade-offs and the impacts of this approach would be from an economic standpoint.
Thanks, Ed. I'll just point out to the committee, we've got a letter, I think we've all seen it, from a group of developers, a study group, pointing out that in their view, the UDL will cause the cost of housing to go up. And I just hope we'll look at that seriously. I think that's a point of view that we can't ignore. And we would need to hear from them what their take is on how these changes will affect the cost of development, and include that in our overall calculation, because if we do anything that's overly onerous, then our assumptions about sales tax growth and the outlook for the economy and so on might have to be modified. And we have been paying too little attention, in my mind, to the input from the professionals so far. So I hope we will have a conversation with them about these items too. And with that, I will hand off to Mr. Winston, I guess, is next.
Mr. Drakes, yes, Mr. Winston is next, and I have no doubt this conversation isn't over. So go ahead, Mr. Winston.
Well, as has been happening lately, Mr. Drakes kind of has a segue into our first kind of round of questions. One, I'll say this is exciting. This is something that, from what I'm hearing, could potentially affect most, if not all, development deals in our city. This is when staff and the council works best, or at its highest level, is on policy and not just specific projects. So kudos to this. This is really exciting stuff. I think to what Mr. Driggs was getting at the end, I think the intent should always be about not just putting in more regulation, but to put in better regulations, to have better outcomes from through the effects of those policy changes. So I would just call us to remember some of the work, a lot of the work of focus that was done just before the pandemic came on, in opening our one-stop shop, and finding ways to streamline development processes internally. We don't want regulation to drive up costs and get us further away from our priorities like affordable housing, affordable workspaces. So I'm sure staff is thinking about this, but as we go through these tests, I'd really like to know how these new transportation studies fit within the more streamlined approach that we started years ago. This is a highly technical process, and I see that in some of the ways that we're measuring success. But I think that there needs to be another kind of output that we're able to describe to the community and for future council members as we have to make decisions based on this. Yes, it's about moving people. Yes, it's about improving the investments on our multimodal transportation networks. But I think we're missing something in terms of safety. All of these technical steps, in the end, I think what we expect outcomes to be is that they will improve the safety aspect around mobility, about whether it's cars, walking, biking, or rail transportation at the best, and at the least, it doesn't make them worse, right? It keeps the status quo. We don't want to make developments, and this has happened too far because of the way we've measured traffic. In some situations, development today makes safety situations worse in certain areas. So I would ask us to think about how do we measure those outcomes so that we as council members, when we're making decisions off of these, and when we are going out and talking to the community about certain developments, how we can kind of quantify how these traffic impacts are going to keep a level of safety and or improve the level of safety. But all in all, this is excellent. I see, how this is a response to, as Ed said, so many different conversations that council has had. One thing I say that this is a way that we can measure, new developments that will actually look to lack parking, right? To not utilize parking decks or on-site parking. One of the questions I think that was legitimate from the community and other council members when some of these petitions have come forward, well, how do you measure and how do you hold accountable this development for the traffic impacts that not having parking will have? So this is really good. But again, I hope that we think about those things. How do we communicate safety improvements, and also how do we really fit this new process into the streamlined approach so that we are not arbitrarily increasing the cost of developments and therefore getting us away from some other parts of the goals. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Winston. And I don't know, Ed, if you want to respond to that, but we are, otherwise, if not, we do need to move on to our Silver Line conversation. Did you have anything you wanted to say?
No, all good. And certainly safety is embedded, but that's a good charge for us to really go back and make sure that we're doing that in a very direct way. So that's good feedback.
Madam Chair, could I just make one quick final comment? I think a lot of what you've described implies investment also by the city. So I hope we're also considering the steps that we have to take in order to achieve the outcomes we want on development. Thank you.
Thank you. Great conversation, and I look forward to hearing more about this. And I do encourage any council member to follow up, and any citizens that have been watching this and have questions, follow up with us so that we can reach out to staff and get more clarity and present more comments on this information, because it's a big step and much needed. So thank you, Ed. I appreciate that. The next agenda item is the Silver Line LPA design, and we've got John Lewis and Andy Mock from CAPS who will present on that. And just to ask you guys, I know we have 60 minutes budgeted, and we've already cut into some of your time, but to the extent possible to minimize the impact and timing, could you just be as brief as possible on the presentation so that we can leave room for council member questions? Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Again, my name is John Lewis, Executive Director of the Charlotte Area Transit System. With me today is Andy Mock, who is the Project Manager for the Silver Line. We get your instruction in terms of being brief, so I'm going to limit my comments and turn the presentation over to Andy in a moment. But I just wanted to go through, during late summer, early fall, we embarked upon our latest round of public outreach. As a result of that round of outreach, we have come back to you with refinements to the corridor, which Andy, to the project along the corridor, and Andy will go through them. But also, we want to begin the conversation that is necessary in a project of this magnitude about phasing of the project. Phasing in terms of how we deliver the project Just much like we did with the Blue Line, we opened the first phase of the Blue Line in 2007, the second phase of the Blue Line extension in 2018. Council members and elected officials throughout Mecklenburg County are engaged right now in a very necessary conversation about how we fund this project, which is very important to our opportunity to move forward. But this phasing discussion is more about how we deliver the project, not from a standpoint of how we fund the project. So I just want to make clear the distinction between the conversation that will begin today about what that phase project will look like in the future. So with that, I'll turn it over to Andy. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. Thank you, Council. I'm going to give you a brief overview of the findings of our last round of public engagement. And as John said, we'll be talking about some of those refinements and the feedback we've heard so far on that survey, as well as an initial introduction to phasing. Next slide, please. Thank you. You can go on to the next one. So just a quick blurb. We really put a lot of energy in trying to get the word out about our public meetings and public engagement. We had 2 meetings in mid-October, both virtual. And we had, many mailers, newspaper ads, all the normal things. In the interest of time, we'll take the next slide. So far, and this date is up through November 3rd, so we have some additional information that we've been collecting. The survey is open to the end of the month, but as of November 3rd, we're at about 190 survey participants. We've had 570 live virtual public meeting video views. That's views of the live meeting that we had that's on YouTube and available. 460 online open house participants. That's folks going in engaging with our online open house experience, as well as 20 plus emails, voicemails, and letters. And actually, those have been really ramping up over the last week or two about some of our refinements. We had over 100 live virtual public meeting attendees. That's people who actually engaged live with us online. Next slide. So next slide. So really the refinements, and we presented the draft of these refinements to TAP, I think it was in early September. So this isn't new information to council, but just kind of as an overview, some of those refinements, what we've heard so far is a strong support for the refinements that we've proposed. About 80% either support or strongly support those refinements. So we feel like we're heading in a good direction. Certainly there's some concerns. And the pie chart on the right kind of shows some of those areas of concerns. And what we found is really probably the area that has raised the most concern is what's called refinement 5, and that's regarding an alignment along Monroe Road. And there we've had some feedback from the community. We also heard some feedback from the community on refinement 4, which is another potential alignment adjustment near Fugate Avenue, adjacent to Bojangles Arena. Next slide. So just to kind of briefly remind council kind of what those refinements are. Refinement 1 is about a station shift, moving a station from what was previously located at Saddle Avenue and relocating it to Moorhead Street. And the main reason for this is really to provide access. We found as we getting into engineering that opportunities to provide access to that Saddle station were very limited because of the nature and context of Wilkinson Boulevard as well as the railroad. So shifting it to Berry Hill, which is right at the Moorhead intersection, provides citizens a much better opportunity to access the station. So far, we've had mostly good feedback. There were some people who were asking about, well, can you combine the stations, those sort of things. But for the most part, we've gotten support from the community on that with some questions about how it's oriented to remount station. Next slide. The next one is about adding a new station, and that is at Summit Avenue. And this is directly adjacent to the proposed pipe and foundry development, as well as the Gold District in Wilmore. This station ad came from a suggestion from the public, so we have determined to add it into the plan. However, it is fully dependent on access provided by NCDOT as part of their interchange modification program. So this station we think could provide good service to the community, but access will be challenged unless we can come up with a suitable access plan with the state. Next slide. And we've received no comments on that one. The next one is another new station. This is in First Ward, And so in this one, this is another community inspired station or adjustment where this came out of the TOD plan, where it's looking at providing a higher quality access for the folks in First Ward in the Garden District. A lot of people were commenting primarily that really it seems like there's a big gap between the Blue Line station and the Central Avenue station, which is kind of further down off the page. And so a lot of the folks on the survey noted that it seems like they're missing a big spot in Center City, and so this was probably the best opportunity to locate a station between the Blue Line and Central Avenue. So it provides good access, good high quality access for low income and minority citizens adjacent. There were some concerns about how that station could affect displacement and any sort of community impacts associated with it. Next slide. And this just shows a brief rendering of what that station could look like. It's between Caldwell and Davidson Street. It would be elevated adjacent to I-277. One of the things that's kind of the ideas behind this that came from the TOD team was more of the opportunity to kind of seek redevelopment in this area and also kind of seek some of that development on the northern side of the Brookshire as well. And this station might serve some of that. Next slide. Refinement 4 is regarding Fugate Avenue, and so this is the opportunity to realign the Silver Line alignment to avoid the Golden Green Hotel to enable a redevelopment, an adaptive reuse of that structure to become more of an affordable housing opportunity. So we've been engaging with the development team as well as the property owner on that topic. There are certainly some cost savings associated with that, but the alignment does push a little bit closer into the Echo Hills neighborhood, and so there was a little greater impact on some of the community in that area. And we've heard some feedback from the community on that topic. Next slide. And Refinement 5 is the one I was mentioning regarding Monroe Road. And in this case, the refinement is really about orienting the alignment into the ultimate configuration of what Monroe Road is. Initially, the Silver Line had assumed that that we would rebuild Monroe Road similar to North Tryon Street for the Blue Line, insert light rail into in the middle of it. So once we really started to look at the engineering of that, the impacts were very great. So we're looking for some alternatives to that to mitigate some of those impacts. And so if you take the next slide, it maybe shows a picture that might show a little bit better than my words. So in this case, the alignment would then shift away from Monroe Road and be along the rear side of the first layer of properties along Monroe Road. Now, this would have the benefit of maintaining everyone's access, all the business access along Monroe Road, and would lessen some of the real estate impacts and business relocation impacts, as well as significant cost savings in reconstructing the road and relocating all the utilities. So that there is a potential cost savings with this alternative. However, it does push the alignment closer to some residential properties along the rear side. And so some of the feedback we've heard is from some of the folks in Sardis Cove who've sent us quite a few emails about this. We've scheduled a meeting with the Sardis Cove community in early December to discuss this with them. But we think that there's quite a bit of benefit, not only in preserving existing business, but also setting up for future development along Monroe Road. Next slide. So now to get into some of the conversation of phasing and implementation, we kind of wanted to kind of reach out to some of our stakeholders and the public, because all the while over this last 2 years as we've been engaging with folks about the Silver Line, we've been talking about the Silver Line as one big project from Belmont to Indian Trail, and really wanted to kind of open the door to having that conversation about phasing. Really to start with, why are we talking about this? Next slide, please. So some of the main rationale for why we're talking about implementation is that New Start's funding, which pays for these sort of projects through the Federal Transit Administration, is very limited and very competitive. So this project would need to be very competitive against many other peer projects across the country. Also, the longer and larger the project, the longer it will take to deliver. So we want to make sure that we're putting forward the best project that competes well for federal funding, but also is going to deliver the project to the community as quickly as possible. In our research for these projects, it's about 1 year per mile of project length. And it's just kind of a rule of thumb that we've been using. So we're kind of using that to kind of kind of tailor the phasing scenarios to put forward the best project we think we can deliver. Also, by the very nature of the project spanning 3 different counties, and the only county that's currently part of the Metropolitan Transit Commission is Mecklenburg, we will need to phase the project in any event until those other jurisdictions, until there can be a financial commitment from those other jurisdictions to contribute towards the project in Gaston and Union County. And there's also a lot of precedent for this. So John mentioned the Lynx Blue Line, but there's also, this is a common practice that was done in Denver, Seattle, Dallas, Utah Transit. Phasing the projects from a big kind of a master plan down to implementation strategies is just an effective way to manage cash flow and open the projects in a segmented way. Next slide. So some of the major considerations for phasing, now we've got this 29 miles. How are the ways that we look about this? So, one of the main things we look at is we want to make sure we're serving key destinations. Each phase needs to be a standalone project. It needs to be able to serve a clear purpose. So we need to make sure that the project is cost effective and serves good ridership generators. And so it's going to collect as much ridership as possible and also be as cost effective as possible. And keeping our eye on the project length and as it relates to the schedule also feeds into is key for us. And also maintenance facilities, and this is a very important for the Silver Line. Anytime we're talking about the Silver Line, we will need, the first phase of the project will need a maintenance facility because we'll be buying a brand new fleet of light rail vehicles to serve the Silver Line. So with the fleet will also come the ability to receive and accept those and maintain those vehicles as our maintenance facilities on South Boulevard and North Brevard Street are at capacity. Next slide. So just, jump to the punchline. So our first phase, we're recommending our preliminary staff recommendation. This is what we presented for information to the Metropolitan Transit Commission last Wednesday night, is a phase A to the southeast from Charlotte Gateway Station to the town of Matthews. We are evaluating different terminus locations along the way with the financial team and with our local stakeholders, evaluating different places to stop. Phase B would be to the west, and that would be Charlotte Gateway Station to I-485. And then the other phases are dependent on regional funding commitments. So that is our preliminary staff recommendation that we put out for public comment and also for stakeholder engagement. Next slide. And this is just kind of a little more of a detailed table kind of showing some of the information from this phase A. That would be about a 15-mile project. It's a very long project considering the Blue Line and Blue Line extension were both over a little over 9 miles apiece. So this would be a relatively long compared to the Blue Line, with about 19,000 riders, and that's key. We want to make sure we're delivering as much of the Silver Line as we can, and delivering as many ridership and providing as many benefits as possible. And some of the key destinations that we serve is Charlotte Gateway Station, the Blue Line, all the town of Matthews, including the Sportsplex and CPCC Levine. So in our phase B recommendation would be Charlotte Gateway Station to I-485. That's about a 7-mile project, collecting about 10,000 riders per day, and that serves I-45 at Wilkinson Boulevard with a large park and ride at the end, similar to the South Boulevard garage. CLT, so we would serve the airport, and Charlotte Gateway Station. Next slide. So some of the feedback we've heard and some of the themes. We have received comments on the phasing. There has been certainly an interest from the community on having phase B go first, basically flipping the recommendations to go to the airport first instead of second. And actually in the last week, we've received more comments in the survey regarding that topic. So that's certainly an area of interest from the community. A lot of comments, I mentioned some of them about neighborhood and community impacts. And so some of those ones when we talk about those alignment refinements, and certainly some comments we've heard. Some interest about stations, some positive about the station at the First Ward, and some concerns about what stations might mean to folks. And then, of course, we always get a lot of comments and questions about how real estate acquisition will be from those affected, property-specific questions associated with a particular person's property that we may be acquiring, or at least part of acquiring. And then, there was concerns about just the overall length of the project, how long it's going to take to deliver. And that's just an ongoing comment that we hear, and how station connections are going to work between the blue line, the silver line, the gold line. And those are things we're actively working through technical evaluations for how those connections will go. Next slide. So some of our next steps, we've completed our 4th round of engagement. We will have completed the survey at the end of this month. We've completed the public meetings. The survey is open to the end of the month. We're having ongoing focused meetings with folks that come up that request it through the survey and public process. We had our information item to the MTC last week, and we would intend to take action or take the action item to the MTC in January for both these refinements and the implementation strategy. All along, we're working through the environmental review and preliminary design process, so that's ongoing as we're working towards delivering our first round of engineering studies. And we're also are beginning a ULI study tentatively scheduled for January through March of next year, and this is in reaction to conversations we've heard regarding having a ULI engagement in some areas of the project. Next slide. And that's all the presentation I have today. I'll take any questions folks might have.
Thanks, Andy. I'm going to go first, defer to our district representative, where most of this is happening, Matt Newton. So go ahead, Matt.
Madam Chair, thank you for that update, Andy. I was interested in your information or your report regarding community engagement in Refinement Area 5. Refinement Area 5. I was wondering, so I believe you had mentioned Sardis Woods, which was a little bit further down Monroe Road and Independence Boulevard than I had anticipated. I thought you might comment on the Woodbury Forest area, more specifically the alignment running against or up to Summerhill Drive. And I was wondering, have there been continued community conversations there with Woodbury Forest, that neighborhood, and if so, what are what's been the outcome, or is there anything to report from that engagement and conversation? And then also, are there any changes to that area right there behind the Hendrick dealership running up against Summerhill Drive on the alignment?
Yeah. Thank you, Councilmember Newton. We did have a community meeting with Woodbury early fall, late summer, and where we presented some more detailed information regarding the usage of the right-of-way that was donated by the Hendricks property. So we did have a community meeting. We feel like we've addressed all of the concerns and questions that we received at that meeting, and we provided more detail information that we feel like we've addressed most of the concerns. There's certainly, may be ongoing concerns that we'll be working through as we continue our environmental and engineering evaluation. We'll continue outreach to the Woodbury community because we understand their sensitivity. But there really hasn't been any change since what we've talked about in the past. And I think we've illuminated the scope of the Silver Line as it relates to Woodbury and the comments that we received to date.
So I'm clear. So what you're saying, Andy, is that no changes whatsoever have been instituted as a result of the concerns expressed by Woodbury Forest residents?
Well, the concerns that were raised by Woodbury Forest were primarily regarding the alignments that we took off the table a year ago. So once we kind of took that off, we're following along the alignment that goes through along the backside of the Hendricks on the property that was dedicated and donated for the purpose of the Silver Line. So there's certainly concerns about, there were some concerns raised about vegetation, about removing kind of trees in this area. We're evaluating ways that we can keep a Class B buffer associated behind it. So there's certainly feedback that we've received that we're addressing, but no major issues, no major changes in the alignment based on any feedback we received.
Yeah, and I guess from what I recall, there were concerns pertaining to displacement as well as as privacy-oriented concerns, and that includes concerns regarding sound and sound noise pollution. So have those been addressed?
No, council member. We have not done the noise evaluation yet. We will be doing that in the coming couple months. So I 100% understand and have heard those comments about noise and visual impacts related to it. We're in the process, for us to really fully address that, we have to do further studies to really understand what those impacts really are. And so we will be undertaking those over the next year, and we'll be able to provide some more direct feedback to the community about if there are any noise impacts and what sort of remediation we might be able to do.
I think that would be great. And so what you're saying, Andy, is that that will be undertaken, and it could be as long as a year before we have any information on those studies?
I think that's correct.
Okay. Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Newton. Next is Mr. Winston.
Yes, great update. Two questions. When you relate, in terms of phasing and time, saying a year per mile, we've been working on the Silver Line for a couple years now. Do those years count? One, as we're looking at the timeline. And two, you mentioned the need for a service yard and that the Brevard facility is full. Does that relate? Are we looking to build something brand new, or will we be looking to potentially lease more space at the Brevard Street lot? Is Norfolk Southern is that something that could potentially be on the table? Also thinking about the intersectionality of that potential with other community aspirations around that site.
Thank you, Councilmember Winston. I think to your first question, the broad rule of thumb of 1 year per mile, yes, we're not losing the couple of years that have gone into the project thus far. That's in totality. So we're not moving backwards, we're moving forwards. Second, in regard to the new maintenance facility, we are moving forward with the North Yard, the Brevard site, the expansion of that. It is still our intent to acquire that facility from Norfolk Southern, and that will be one of the areas where we can deliver the new maintenance facility. As we continue to grow, this is one of the areas where we're a little bit behind the curve. Right now, with the opening of the Gold Line, we are really in a bad shape from a vehicle maintenance and storage. And so the North Yard Brevard facility will allow us to catch up to where we are now. As we continue to build other rail lines, this is going to be an ongoing need into the future.
Is that it, Mr. Winston?
Yeah, yes, thank you. That's it.
Okay, any other questions? Let's see. I don't see any other hands raised. Any other council members, Mr. Eggleston or Mr. Driggs? Okay, I just have one question for either John or Andy. Is there any way that I understand the federal funding issue, and we of course want to position ourselves to get that funding, especially for the first phase. But is there any other scenario in which we could accelerate the completion of this line? I don't know how many lines are this long in the country. I don't know how long Denver's is. I know this would be one of the longest, but are there other lines similar to this that have been built faster, and what could we do to be able to accelerate the construction of the entire line?
So, Madam Chair, it's a great question and a complicated one. At this point, we have been moving forward to get this project to a level of design and engineering that will enable us to be ready to move into the capital investment grant program. But number one, before we do that, we have to answer the local funding question. And that conversation, as you all know, is going on right now. Once we get that, then once we answer the funding question, there are ways that we could look at, from a design and project delivery standpoint, that could help us shave some time off. But that's more in the project delivery. Do we do, as an example, a design build? Do we do a design build, operate, and maintain agreement with a P3 manager on this? So there are ways that we can shave time off after we answer the funding question and we continue to embark on into further areas of design. But that's more in project delivery, and we're not at that stage right now.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, well, I think that wraps it up then. If there are no other questions, John and Andy, I didn't mean to have you cut your presentation. I hope if there's anything else you wanted to share, you certainly could, because we do have a few more minutes.
I think we've met our goals. We certainly want to give the committee as much time as possible to engage with the team with your questions and answers on that. So thank you for the opportunity this afternoon.
Great. Thank you, everybody. Good presentations, lots of information. And again, I hope everybody will follow up with either the CATS team or the DOT team on additional questions. So if I don't have any additional questions right now, let's go ahead and I'll ask for a motion.
Madam Chair?
Yes, Mr.
I posted a question in the chat about when the sales tax would commence under the phased approach. Would it still be our intention to seek a sales tax, the full sales tax, starting in 2023 in the referendum?
Did you want me to respond to that? Based on what we are working on right now and what we presented to you at the annual strategy session, the goal is to, if we get the authorization from the General Assembly, to go in November of 22 for a collection that begins in 2023, which pushes us into FY24. So that'll be July of 23, which pushes. So everything then goes from July of 2024, 20 years out, in terms of how the implementation period. So yes, right now, if we were to get an authorization from the General Assembly, the goal will be November of 2022 for a collection to begin July of 2023.
Right, I assume that, but in effect, what that means is we have kind of a sinking fund model because we're collecting enough tax to pay for the whole system, recognizing that the build out of the system will probably take up to 20 years. So there are projects for which we are collecting sales tax revenue starting in 2023
yes.
that won't even commence for 8 or 10 years. So, yes. You know, we just have to explain that. I mean, the public will have to buy into the concept that we have a vision and that we're pre-funding parts of the vision if we commence with the sales tax in 2023. But just want to clarify that. Thank you.
Very good point, sir. I think that's one of the reasons why improvements to our bus system, implementing Envision My Ride will be the first thing out of the gate, outside of the non-transit improvements to roadways and greenways and bikeways, because those could go earlier while Silver Line, Gold Line, Red Line, a Blue Line could be going through some design. And I think John can speak to this, but without any additional funding, it might be challenging to move the Silver Line into another phase at some point. But it's at a point where it's advanced beyond the other lines. But we want to make sure that the focus of that revenue from sales tax will be on implementing the Envision My Ride outside of the other things that we're going to do rail-wise.
Right, and I think as the official spokesperson for the Mayor Pro Tem's initiative on buses, critical that we have deliverables for the marketing process. And so I agree with that. And I think we just need to be upfront about the fact that we can't fund all of the rail proposals if we wait until work on any given project commences before we start realizing revenue. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Driggs. With that, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
Okay, all in favor, go ahead and turn your cameras off or leave the room. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.